Good morning and welcome to the Columbia University World Leaders Forum. By bringing us in direct contact with global policymakers and heads of state, this forum allows us to better understand some of the most urgent matters that all of us care about and ultimately have the responsibility to help resolve. It is an ideal way to start the new academic year, and we are grateful to all of those who have helped us in presenting these world leaders at Columbia this fall. Before the week is over, we will have had the privilege of hearing speeches from the leaders of Ghana, Colombia, Mauritius, Austria, Nepal, and others. This morning, our distinguished guest is Doris Leuthard, President of the Swiss Confederation. Before introducing the President, I want to recognize Ambassador and Consul General André Schaller and all the other members of the Swiss delegation. Thank you and welcome here. Switzerland's President is selected by the members of the Swiss Federal Council, who choose one of their peers. Ms. Leuthard has received that honor twice, first in 2010 and again in 2017. She entered government as a member of Parliament, and later, during her time on the Council, she served as head of the Department of Economic Affairs and continues to oversee the Department of Environment, Transport, Energy, and Communications. As will be evident from her remarks this morning, the President is an accomplished attorney and legal scholar. She received her law degree from the University of Zurich. Notwithstanding its distinctive history and culture and its long-standing commitment to neutrality, the challenges confronting Switzerland are very much the product of this particular moment and the currents of our global society. Switzerland is in the process of increasing the transparency of its banking system, trying to overhaul the nation's corporate tax system, and navigating issues such as mass migration and the future of the European Union that are buffeting its neighbors and that hold the potential to change the face and identity of Europe. The country approaches these issues with a political system infused with an unusual degree of democracy. While most laws are drafted and decided upon by Parliament, there is a process by which the citizens, may put those laws to a general vote or, when appropriate, propose amendments to the Constitution. Switzerland has also earned a reputation for being an especially adept mediator of international conflict, with a willingness to shoulder its weight and much more in the shared global effort to spread peace. From civil wars in Burundi and Nepal to more recently the Colombian conflict involving FARC, Switzerland has been involved in negotiations that have helped bring an end to armed conflict. Repeatedly, Switzerland has chosen to act as an engaged and responsible citizen among the community of nations. In keeping with this proud tradition of international engagement, President Leuthard recently offered the services of her nation to help address the North Korean crisis, an offer that has refocused attention on the President and her nation. Madam President, we are all eager to have you here with us this morning, hear what you have to say. Please join me now in welcoming the President of the Swiss Confederation, Doris Leuthard.
Well, Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Swiss government, I'd like to thank you for your kind invitation, and I'm very happy that we can together pass an hour and discuss about the rules of law, the situation of the planet. I'm very pleased that I can be at a very famous university, because it's always important to have this exchange with students and to have a dialogue and also an understanding from students what we in politics are doing, what we prepare, because you as future leaders will have the solutions we did not find, or perhaps we find solutions you can then implement. So it's very important that we have this contact, and I'm very happy that I can be with you this morning. And thank you again, Mr. President, for the invitation. The rule of law, or the law of the jungle, for the United States and the Swiss Confederation, sister republics, the answer is very clear. There needs to be rule of law. But national law can only apply for all if it is embedded in a global set of rules and is thus applicable to all. A state that abides by international law is not a weak state. A state that upholds international law helps the weak and gains in strength itself as a result. Switzerland is a comparatively small, neutral country. It is not part of any military alliance, and it has a highly developed economic and research center. It has an alpine territory, particularly exposed to the impact of climate change. But on our own, we can neither protect our Alps nor our people, just as no state can pursue economic policy on its own. We are dependent on a set of reliable global rules. Even the US, as a superpower, with its outstanding universities and great innovations, is an integral part of the global whole and needs a set of international rules. Regardless of whether a country is large or small, all have an interest in seeing that international law is applied. There may be a few states dotted around the globe right now that believe themselves to be the strongest. Today, we are witnessing a period of far-reaching geopolitical and economic change, similar to that seen at the time of the birth of our two sister republics. It is characterized by interdependence and globalization and a regional and vertical shift of wealth. The impact of the digital revolution is transnational. The potential impact on the value-added chain, the labor markets, the way we exchange and process information, on influence and power, on sovereignty and dependence are huge. We can already feel the effects of all that today, the positive and the negative. The impact of climate change, migration and terrorism can also be felt internationally. These phenomena give rise to fear because they exceed the individual sphere of influence. And it is precisely because we are increasingly faced with such developments, because the individual is increasingly unable to influence these changes themselves, that we need international law. And that's, once again, we are here in New York at the UN conference to talk about international law. Changes are manifested in a regional and vertical shift in wealth. On the one hand, the world is better off now than it was 30 years ago. Globally, the number of people living in extreme poverty has halved since the 1990s. Maternal mortality rate has been significantly reduced. Access to primary education, access to electricity, access to power has drastically increased. The international community has set a course to further improve the livelihoods of people around the globe by committing to the Sustainable Development Goals. the Sustainable Development Goals, who are a new international regulation which now has on national level been introduced. On the other hand, however, the middle classes in the highly developed West find themselves squeezed. Many developed countries have experienced a decrease in the size of their middle class and in the share of total income going to the middle class. Many citizens in the West increasingly identify globalization as the cause for the growing squeeze on wages, the pressure to perform, and the perceived decline of their country's prosperity. In response, political forces increasingly push the demand for greater national sovereignty, sometimes explicitly as a rejection of the international legal order. But it is possible to see that tensions between that development that I've mentioned manifest themselves across the board, globally, nationally, and in the lives of each and every one of us, politically, socio-economically, and culturally. That's not a theory, it's reality. All too often, the solution that emerges is nationalism and populism, and economically protectionism. These phenomena feed on a variety of sources, and we have to be aware of these. As an urge to withdraw in the face of the boundaries lost through globalization, as a rejection of open, tolerant social models, as a strategy to answer citizens' justified expectations of their governments, to safeguard prosperity and living standards in a continually changing context. In other words, as an instrument to safeguard power on a domestic level, and as a way of strengthening international influence. The Hartford Consensus on the validity of international laws and convention is coming under pressure. The more fractured this international consensus becomes, the greater the appeal to resort to national solutions. The more populist and nationalist the agenda becomes, the greater the interest in seeing the collapse of international consensus will be, and the greater the risk will be that the rule of the most powerful wins out. Ladies and gentlemen, international law is not a pick-and-choose stand, where you can just take what you want and leave the rest. International law is binding. It was negotiated, it was signed, and it was ratified. On the basis of its tradition and as a host state of humanitarian Geneva, so international humanitarian law, my country is particularly attached to one body of international law, international humanitarian law. Its aim is to preserve a minimum of humanity in war. I am appalled, although one of the greatest achievements of the modern global community, international humanitarian law is increasingly being systematically violated. You can see in most of the conflicts that this law, which was negotiated, is very often violated. The main challenge at the moment is to improve respect for this body of law and to prevent its credibility from being steadily undermined. Mastering this challenge is one of the priorities of Switzerland's foreign policy. And because we insist on this humanitarian law, we have a role also to raise the flag wherever on the planet this international humanitarian law is violated. We raise our flag also to say you can't solve these conflicts by violating law and by normally by armed conflicts, we have to solve this by dialogue. That's also, we offer our good services in a lot of conflicts, or we offer our services that countries find a platform to communicate. For example, between Georgia and Russia, we have been helpful. In the Syrian conflict, with a lot of dialogue in Geneva, or we defend in Iran the interests of the United States, because it's much more easier to pass through Swiss diplomatic channels to talk and communicate with each other. International law is not just being violated, it is also being eroded. This often occurs insidiously. The principle of the universality of human rights is a cornerstone of international humanitarian law and has been reiterated in numerous conventions, declarations, and resolutions. And yet, not only is this principle being questioned more and more openly, the term human rights itself has come to stand in competition with terms such as human values. However, the two terms are not interchangeable. Values are not the same as rights. And while values are intended to guide us, rights and the protection of those rights are binding. Or in other words, even those who disregard values are entitled to have their fundamental human rights protected. It is dangerous if we start to water down the meaning of language in international discussions and with regard to international law. And it will be a challenge to reach a common understanding of those concepts in seeking to address global challenges. I will cite the example of infrastructure, which embodies globalization like no other, the Internet of the digital environment. We have to give through to how this digital environment is governed. But what does that mean exactly? Does this mean the autonomous sovereignty of the digital environment, independent from national or international law? Or do we mean the opposite, namely sovereignty of the state in defining modalities of control over the digital environment? And what does this latter form of sovereignty aim to achieve? I'm sure, as a university, you know all these questions and you can help us to find solutions. So far, there is no one. We began discussions and we will discuss in December at the Internet Governance Forum in Geneva with a lot of specialists, but we have to solve these issues. To suppress criticism, to protect domestic businesses, or to protect in the sense of data and privacy, or to fight against cybercriminality. Well, the international community, governments, the private sector, and civil society have to reach some kind of agreement. This discussion is crucial, and the free press and free minds must be allowed to contribute to a solution. Ladies and gentlemen, change is reflected in the shaping of the international order, its institutions, mechanisms, and conventions. Reforms are needed at the UN and at various other international organizations. They were mostly created after the Second World War, and today we have to adapt reality with the governance of these organizations. International sets of rules need to be developed further. Non-state actors need to be included in the search for solutions, as well as scientists. Over the last 10 to 15 years, multilateral sets of rules have not been very successful. I remember 10 years ago, I passed my whole summer in Geneva at the WTO Doha conference. A lot of discussions, but finally 2 members disagreed, so no solution. The Doha round failed. Many efforts at reform are going round in circles, which makes the conclusion of Agenda 2030, the Paris Climate Agreement, or the UN resolution on sustainable peace all the more important. It shows also it's still possible to have new, universally agreed regulation. UN Secretary General Guterres is actively pursuing reform of the UN system in 3 areas. First, peace and security. Second, development. And third, management. To gear the UN towards addressing current and future challenges. Switzerland is very active in these processes and tries also here to moderate between the different interests, different actors, and to find as fast as possible solutions. There is a need to implement and further develop international bodies of law. Governance structures and working mechanisms need to reflect present realities. We have new powers. We have a shift of power also towards Asia. We have a lot of NGOs. Also, these voices must be reflected in the new structures. We also have to recognize that global actors launch their own initiatives to set up international or supranational organizations and forums. That is to be welcomed as it places responsibility on those actors. But there has to be a way of ensuring that such forums accept international rules and conventions. And we always have to ask ourselves whether and to what extent these bodies enjoy legitimacy. Respect for international law and its promotion have always been a high priority of Swiss foreign policy. We do this out of the conviction that international law and its bodies provide a basis for peace, for stability, and the protection of human beings. But we also do it out of bare necessity. Switzerland is one of the most globalized nations in the world, one of the most open countries, and together with the US, normally we are also ranked on the most innovative countries all over the world. And this openness, working together with others, is part of this success story. Our economy is strongly driven by exporting industries of both goods and services. Access to markets, as well as compliance with international trade regimes and rules by all partners, are fundamental. It gives our economy a solid base, and you know also your partner is relying on international rules. Switzerland is the 7th largest financial center in the world. And we as a small country are also investing a lot in the United States. We are ranked number 6 as investor in the US. Quite surprisingly for a small country. But it shows when you have good partners which share the rules of law, which are open economies, this drives the economy. This also is attractive for young people, for new solutions, new companies, new ideas. Switzerland has therefore an interest in stable, a global financial architecture and in transparency of financial flows. This is why Switzerland actively participated in the framework of the OECD Global Forum on Transparency and Exchange of Information for Tax Purposes. We would like to see this also in some American states increasing. It ensures that the international standards regarding transparency and exchange of information are complied with and are implemented in a uniform manner internationally. Switzerland is particularly vulnerable when it comes to climate change. Perhaps you think, well, as a landlocked country, there's no reason to be affected. But As I mentioned, our Alps are extremely vulnerable. We have double global warming in our Alps than in the world average. Over the last 150 years, the average temperature in my country has risen by 2 degrees Celsius. That is more than twice the global average. Although our per capita emissions are very low, we are dependent on the measures of all states. It is vital, therefore, that the Paris Agreement is implemented. As you know, Switzerland is a neutral country. Neutrality is defined under international law, with rights and with obligations of a neutral state. That is part of our tradition of good services, good offices, and humanitarian aid. Neutrality does not apply to military operations authorized by the UN Security Council, for the latter is acting under a mandate from the community of states in order to re-establish peace and international security. Nor does the law of neutrality prevent neutral states from supporting such operations. But we are engaged in all these UN peacekeeping missions. It is, of course, fundamental to Switzerland that our neutrality is internationally recognized and respected. But it is fundamental to our interest that the UN system works and the Security Council remains capable and credible in its decision-making. And finally, it is also fundamental that international conventions are respected. I mentioned, ladies and gentlemen, our particular attachment to international humanitarian law. I also mentioned that the main challenge consists in improving respect for IHL, not in reforming it. Indeed, the basic tenets of IHL are timeless. Do not harm civilians. Do not harm civilians. Was once agreed. Was once the DNA of many countries. Treat prisoners humanely. Treat prisoners humanely. Do not use excessive force. Care about the sick and wounded. Minimize the cruelty of war. There is, however, something missing in IHL, a genuine dialogue. Dialogue is an essential ingredient for respect. Surprisingly, the Geneva Conventions and their additional protocols did not provide for such a regular dialogue among states at the global level. Switzerland has therefore been working with the International Committee of the Red Cross on bringing to life a forum of states dedicated to the implementation of IHL. A large majority of states is deeply committed to the idea. So are we. Ladies and gentlemen, our interests as an open, globalized, rules-based and democratic nation are best protected and promoted in the framework of respected international rules based on agreed standards enshrined in international law. I am certain that in view of globalization, geopolitical and geo-economic changes, respect for international law and credible, transparent and accountable international organizations are not only in Switzerland's core interests, but in the interests of all of us. You, as young leaders of tomorrow, will have to work that these international rules are again the pillar of peace, the peace for to protect a lot of human beings and to protect the planet. Try to help us that the rules-based system all over the planet is the DNA of the young leaders of tomorrow. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was great.
Thank you. So we sit or take the micro?
So we can take questions, and there are 2 microphones. I will call on you, and the President can respond. But to begin with, I'll just ask a few questions, Madam President. So on this, thank you very much for those remarks, and I think this is an audience, certainly at this university, who feels very much aligned with what you said. This role of Switzerland in the world, of being a mediator, neutral, and the like, I think we're all interested in how that is sustained in today's world. And the most recent instance that you've identified where Switzerland is offering to play this role is with respect to North Korea. Could you say something about why that's a credible offer? I mean, any country could say we're ready to help with solving the crisis with North Korea, but Switzerland has a kind of special role in the world that makes that interesting and attractive. How does that happen in that particular case, reflecting more generally on the role of Switzerland?
Yes, thank you for this question. I think, well, we can profit first that in Geneva we have most of international organizations which are present there. So actually you can approach all kinds of sectoral issues in Geneva. Mm-hmm. We are a safe place. We are a discreet place. When you meet in Geneva, we can organize this that no media really are present. So a lot of leaders are looking for a place where you don't know they meet. And in North Korea especially, we have a special role because for more than 6 years, our soldiers are at the border between North and South Korea, the demarcation line, together with Sweden. Mm-hmm. We are present here for more than 60 years. And we are one of the few countries who have humanitarian projects within North Korea. So this allows us to have an entry point to also the political system where I think together with Norway we are practically alone there. And the neutrality, perhaps, Mr. President, is the last point. We don't have to defend Western or Eastern interests. We are not a member of NATO, so all these elements create some kind of credibility for us. And it's an offer. Well, we don't know yet if the parties involved accept our offers of good offices. We know the Foreign Ministry of China already had a positive answer. Now we had the UN sanctions, so we will follow. The offer is here, the partners know it, and now it must be discreet under diplomats. Whenever they wish, we are ready to do this job.
Very interesting. I assume that in the world of globalization and the establishment of norms of openness and so on, to some extent maintaining that position of neutrality must be difficult for Switzerland in some sense. Like take the banking system. So the role with North Korea in part is because things can be done privately. It doesn't have to be under the glare of the media spotlight. Neutrality demands a kind of closure in a way. I mean, to be successful, it's a good thing. On the other hand, you want more and more transparency in the world. So the banking system of Switzerland, as we all know from reading papers and so on, is under transformation. How, in the context of Switzerland, how is that position of neutrality and what's needed to sustain that itself under pressure from globalization of norms?
I think for us it's two totally different discussions. We have first, at the beginning, we did not understand that when it comes to your private sphere, the wish of many countries is to be totally transparent. Because, well, we still think your medical data, your insurance data, your bank account, that's actually part of your private sphere. Okay, the international rules are now different. I think a lot of transparency is needed, so here we adapt it. I'm not so sure if all the information you get out of all these data is really helpful for human mankind, but we do it. We have not an issue anymore. We are a violation. Was it chemical weapons or whatever?
Do you feel that there's a risk of other member states potentially leaving, and what do you feel could be done in the next decade to strengthen the EU as a whole?
I think it's probably the opposite, because now you see Brexit is quite a challenge, and I think people begin to realize perhaps it was not the best decision, but it is a decision. We have to accept that. So I think what you see for the moment among the EU members, there's more cooperation than before. That's also, they are quite tough with UK, which might not be very good for all of us, but you see more, either you are a member or you're out, and there's no in between. So even when the EU now is also going to have more economic growth, which is good for all of us, they have to solve some issues. And probably one element of the British result is also because they had one crisis after the other, one unsolved challenge after the other, and people recognize, so Europe is losing power and influence and has one crisis after the other, so please stabilize and give us hope and the future. And I think today with President Macron, with also younger presidents who have another view on Europe, who want to see more importance, more economic growth, this can really turn the page and give more cooperation and a stronger feeling. We are together, we want to have our place in the world than we had before. And I'm pretty much sure that Angela Merkel will be re-elected, so this can be quite a powerful couple for the next years.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you very much. My question is regarding neutrality. It is beyond doubt that mediating between conflicts is crucial, and that you play a unique role in the world sphere of politics. But there are still many cases of inevitable armed conflicts that you naturally, unless you go through the UN, you don't get involved in. And my question is, regarding that your peculiar position of combination of a tremendously powerful economic and political country, and at the same time you yourself and your party belonging to the Christian Democratic Party of Switzerland, how do you accommodate the fact that you both have the means and the principles to involve yourselves in those conflicts when your foreign policy prevents you from doing that?
Well, we have armed forces, we have a strong military services, we have also quite a huge budget on that, but it's more to prevent Switzerland from our neighbors. You know, in the Second World War, we have been circled by Nazis, by fascist organizations, so actually to have an army and this neutrality helped us to survive and helped us also to, that we have a lot of refugees coming to Switzerland, we could protect them. And in these conflicts, in these armed conflicts, we have pretty much the same position. Being neutral allows us, via diplomatic channels, to work in the background, helps us via our humanitarian aid to protect people who suffer from this conflict, and perhaps also here to defend the international humanitarian law. this is not always easy. We have also an industry who produces arms. So this is also always a debate. Is this balanced, or that's why we have a very restrictive regulation where and to which country they can sell arms. So this is perhaps also an element which shows it's not an easy position. We take our responsibility, but we prefer always peacekeeping process, dialogue, and not being a part of an armed conflict.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you, Madam President. You mentioned the collaboration between government, the private sector, and civil society or non-governmental organizations. And I'm interested in your eyes, what do you think the role of civil society or these NGOs is in upholding international law or aiding in conflict resolution? And do you see that role as growing or even evolving in the coming years as we experience these changing times?
I think it's absolutely important that we see such a lot of important organizations having a voice in all these difficult questions. And I think the role is increasing. We've seen it, for example, in the negotiation process of the Paris Agreement. We will also have today a panel on private sector investments for SDGs. So we need definitely the private sector, not only for financing, we need it for technologies, for innovation. We need it also because sometimes politicians have not, well, they have a 4-year circle to overview, but a company or NGOs have a much longer view and vision, and this is very important. So in Switzerland, by our direct democracy, we have already, when we discuss a new law, a high influence of NGOs or civil organizations. They have the same rights like a political party. They are very strong in lobbying for their interests, transparent way, but I think it's very important for us. That's why I think that my link to the governance of all these international organizations, we should also think how we can structure this influence and bring them in the political dialogue. And I think in the US it's pretty much the same development like we see in Europe.
Yes?
Hi. You mentioned the need for reform at, I think, the UN Security Council. And of course, like, the UN Security Council has 5 permanent members, like, somehow representing the global West and the global East. And they have absolute veto power. And there's been a lot of criticism against this system because it creates sort of like, you know, the nuclear powers who get to strong-arm the rest of the world. But if I wasn't sure if you were referring to reforming like that part, and also if that does require reform, how would you even begin to change that setup? Because it's you know, they, like the 5 permanent members have, you know, the nuclear weapons.
Well, I think the reforms of the UN Security Council is very crucial, very political. So for many years we tried to adapt a little bit the system. And I think most of you all, sometimes when one power declares his veto, we are not very pleased about that. But anyhow, there's a discussion. There's also transparency, who stands for what. And even perhaps when they don't decide because of a veto, there's a development. There's something who happens. And Switzerland for the moment is chairing the nuclear suppliers group. So here we discuss if also countries who have nuclear weapons can be members, even when they are not part of the NPT. Non-proliferation treaty, and what could be the consequences. So we think also here better to involve all important partners and give some rules, some expectations, what should happen, is better than to leave it to some countries who discuss under themselves. And you know, nuclear weapons, for the moment, this is an issue. And we must try that there's no overreaction, that we can stabilize also tensions, and that's typically what Switzerland tries to do. And I'm sorry to say that sometimes there are some personalities, some male personalities, which have the power. So we should have perhaps also some more female who have another approach.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you, Madam President. So you have been talking about how Switzerland is involved in peacemaking. However, this is not the case with Egypt. I mean, Switzerland supports the current authority in Egypt, which is led by Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. This general has been killing youth in Egypt. This general has been detaining youth in Egypt. And I don't know, I can't see how Switzerland is bringing peace to Egypt by supporting such a dictator. I mean, I have friends who are supposed to be in such universities, but they're rotting in prison. I have friends who are supposed to be in such universities, but they're now dead because of this man. And this man is actually attending the United Nations. And this man is actually participating in putting what's called the international law. So how can I believe in the United Nations, in the international law, in Switzerland's role in peacemaking, while you're actually, you know, dealing with this man he led Egypt through a military coup, after all. You say that we are here for democracy, we're here for elections and all this stuff. However, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi came, you know, through a military coup, after all. Thank you, Madam President.
I understand that it's difficult for you to see this president and how the situation of Egypt. But we accept also elections. And when a president, even if you don't like him, is elected in a correct way, then he's the elect president. And then we work together with this government. And we have a lot of projects in Egypt on democracy, on the rules of law. We try to get in our economy, that they create jobs for people. And we try, whenever people are in prison or there's no free expression of your will, or journalists are in prison, here we try to help them. And then it's better to work with this president than against this regime.
I'm sorry, Mr. President, but this man wasn't elected.
I think this could be debated for a long time.
Yes.
There was a president who was elected in 2012. He was supposed to end his reign in 2016. Abdel Fattah al-Sisi came in 2013. How was he elected?
So, understand.
I understand you, but you must, one country cannot tell another, you must now have again elections, or the election you had is not valuable anymore. This is a discussion, except that's why we have here the United Nations, we have other platforms, but when a power is in vigor, in force, we must talk with them and we must try to do the best with them, not against them. This is not helpful.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, President Leuthard, for coming and talking to us today. I had a question. You were saying earlier about the Swiss Alps, how they're so vulnerable to climate change the years ahead, and especially the idea of climate change. It transcends boundaries, national boundaries. It goes on to the international level. And I was wondering, especially in the UN talks this week. Yesterday, President Miroslav Lujak, he was talking at the Cathedral about the oneness of the world, the peace, the sustainable action. And so, what do you really hope will be accomplished, especially with regard to sustainable development in the week ahead at the UN talks? And also, a not so political question, do you have a favorite Swiss writer?
Well, I think SDG and like the Paris Agreement are for me successful new agreements, and now the implementation of all this is crucial. And as usually, it's about money. It's about financing. We will have today panels on that. We will have later on this year how we can finance all the needs to implement measures and to support countries, developing countries who have not enough of public resources. And here, that's private sector engagement. Initiatives also from academia, because, well, a lot of technical solutions can be helpful. So to combine all this will be crucial in the upcoming years. And that's why I see not enough which is done, not enough ambition, but it goes in the right direction. We should really increase the speed of implementing all these measures, because you see the impacts of both costs much more than acting now and being ambitious. And I have Swiss writers, for example, Martin Suter. I don't know if you know him, but on the internet you can see that's one of my favorites.
Thank you very much.
So we're almost out of time. If you could ask questions very briefly, each of you, and then the President can decide which one she wants to answer and which one she will overlook. So let's go very quickly. Please ask your question.
Thank you very much. Earlier you spoke about imposing sanctions on countries that violate humanitarian and international law. So for some countries such as Russia, which the EU has already imposed economic sanctions on, these seem to have little or no effect. So what other steps do you propose to take for these countries for which sanctions are not enough?
Thank you. So let's take the other questions, and go ahead, please.
Good morning. I was just going to ask, because you mentioned the Paris Agreement and climate change, how Switzerland, what is the core thing that they're doing to tackle these issues, and how they can inspire other countries, states, and organizations also to tackle these issues?
So sanctions on international humanitarian law violations, climate change, yes. Next.
Hi, Your Excellency. My question is about technology. So I know you mentioned briefly about how we live in a digital transformation or digital disruption. It's one or the other. It's how you perceive. What is your stance for Switzerland in the future on implementing these new technologies?
I think we better stop there, and you can answer, and we'll draw it to a close.
Okay, well, I begin with climate change. Again, we are also in Switzerland, we are very ambitious on our goals, although we have already a very low level emissions per capita. I think here in the US you have 4 times more or 5 times more than we have, but you can improve. The good news is you can improve, and that's a potential. I think it's always a combination of technology. It's also new, for example, in transport. I think you can improve quite heavily here. Also, if you look at your buildings, standards of buildings could be an example. So I think with a lot of countries, there's now a platform to exchange best practices, good ideas, and also find the financing for that. So the ideas would be here, but it's up to every country now to implement what seems to be valuable. But I think there's a lot of things going on, and it's up to every country to really now head forward. Your question about sanctions again. Well, Switzerland had the presidency of the OECD, so also some kind also of moderation between Ukraine and Russia. And the parties, we had the Minsk agreement, actually a good solution how the population and the powers could develop the future. It's not reached yet. It's not implemented yet. So we still hope that the conflict parties again follow the road of the agreement of Minsk. And here you see Russia has a lot of sanctions already, and nothing happened actually. And therefore we have to also think on other elements, how we can how we can find a way for the population who lives in these areas, because they are every day confronted with violence. Every day they live in unstable situation. You have all over the world more than 1 billion children who knows nothing but violence and instability. So I think, again, here we must be creative and find solutions. Sometimes it's face-saving for the leaders, face-saving solution that's okay, this I can do, and so here a lot of fantasy and discussions to see why is it not rational, why is it so emotional, and here I think Switzerland, our diplomats and others can try to find such elements. Technology, yes, for example, fintech, when it comes to financing, could be a powerful answer also for countries like the African continent, who has not a lot of money, but with fintech you have a lot of small contributors who can make a change. Technology, when you see now also, yes, in transport, well, a lot of people like to have a car. And when here new technologies can help us, that you can drive, we don't want to have restrictions on your personal mobility, but you can do it more smart. That's the best way we can improve. And here I think Switzerland, as a very innovative country, as well as the US, have something to say and can work together. And this must go through academia. That's why we spend a lot of money for our universities, for you, because we think here are the brains who can give us these answers. We afterwards, as politicians, can implement and try the best that it's covering all our society. So I count on you.
So, Madam President, to close with an endorsement of money coming to universities, is a welcome.
Presidents always want to have more money, I know that.
That's true, that is true. Madam President, thank you very much for spending this morning with us. Very illuminating. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All the best to you. Thank you.